Some of the images you'll create in Photoshop will be displayed as web page backgrounds rather than as foreground images. A background image is a single file that gets coded in the HTML code of a web page to repeat itself over and over across and down the background of a web page in a viewer's browser. So an image that starts out as a small graphic in Photoshop like this can get converted to a GIF or a JPEG, coded with HTML, and result in a background that looks like this. Here you see that small image I just showed you in Photoshop repeating itself over and over across the background of a page in my Safari web browser. The advantage of a file being coded as a background image is that the viewer's browser has to download only one image file, and that image file can be pretty small to fill the background of an entire web page. Before I show you how to create background images for the web in the other movies in this chapter, I'd like to bring up some design considerations for you to keep in mind when you're designing background images. One of those is the size of the image. The smaller the background image that you make in Photoshop, the more times it will repeat across a web page. And that will give a very different look to the page. So for example, here's a web page background made with a smaller version of the same image that made this web page background. So when you're creating a source file in Photoshop for a background, size your image for the look that you have in mind. The color of a background image is also important. Try to stick with colors that don't contrast with one another like this, because a high contrast image can be quite distracting when it's repeated over and over, and it can make it difficult to see and focus on foreground elements that are placed on top of it on a web page. Another design consideration is the brightness of the background image. If you plan to use dark foreground elements, either text or objects, like this, then make a background image that's light. If you plan on using light foreground elements like this text, then you don't want a light background as well, because the foreground elements will be hard to read. And the opposite is true too. You can see in this example that dark foreground elements are hard to read on dark backgrounds, but light foreground elements are easy to read. And finally, try to stay away from medium value background images because colors of almost any brightness value will be hard to read against a medium background. When you're designing web backgrounds, choosing the right size, color, and brightness can have a big effect on the way your page looks in a viewer's browser. Keep these factors in mind as you work through the movies in this chapter, where you'll learn how to make different kinds of background images in Photoshop.